The British press, widely known around the world for its amazing standards of reporting, only covering the most pressing issues of our time, and of course, their professionalism. But what if I told you that the British press and British journalism was uniquely bad? And perhaps is one of the worst in the entire world. And you guys might think I'm actually exaggerating, but I promise you I'm not. And I was thinking, like, what scope should this video be? Like, topic is so vast. This video could be like, I don't know, 20 hours long, but I'm gonna try and really focus it onto two things. Kind of like the classism and nepotism, and how journalism in this country is so infused with politics, and also how the BBC, which is meant to be impartial, actually moves the Overton window of discussion into a certain place which is very, very right wing. And the BBC does not serve the public, it doesn't serve the public interest. It's essentially a propaganda network for the Conservative Party, and when they're gone, probably just generally centrists, capitalist interests. And the BBC, especially, has always had a pretty good reputation around the world. You always see like little clips going viral about like BBC journalist does this, or BBC journalist is objective, or BBC journalist Andrew Neil destroys Ben Shapiro, despite the fact that Andrew Neil is a conservative as well. That's just how good the British press are. Even if they have political bias, they don't let it affect their questioning. Now, the only people who might think the British press is actually good is maybe Americans, because their press is so corporate. And I would agree there is a more direct line from like actual corporate overlords and the American press, like Jeff Bezos, for example. But at the same time, we don't really need that in the UK because we have press barons who usually like inherit the paper from their family anyway, and it goes back generations. And that's the unique thing about the UK, because England as like a nation state is probably one of the oldest in the world. And you guys might be thinking that's a weird statement, but in terms of like our legal system, the people who've ruled the country, it pretty much goes back to like 1,000 years ago, where you have something older like China, for example, as a concept of a nation. In terms of their history, there's far more upheaval, different rulers, and even less than 100 years ago, they completely changed their political system. We just don't have that in the UK, which leads to a host of unique problems that generations upon generations of journalists, politicians, and businessmen have all gone to the exact same school: Eton, Oxford, and Cambridge. And literally, some of the private schools in this country are older than most countries in the entire world. And that establishment is very hard to break away from, and it still completely dominates our journalism. And, you know, part of that is why, as a country, we're in such a mess. So all of that coming up for you today. Please like the video. Also follow me on social media, mainly on Instagram, my personal and travel accounts. And I don't really use Twitter anymore, but check out my Threads and Blue Sky. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon, and there you can get access to the Discord server. So like I said, this video could be so long, but I really want to focus, and I really want to use just one article to illustrate my point about the British press. You might think that's not enough, but I think this article and who wrote it basically sums up every single problem with our media. Now, you guys might have seen this going viral, especially if you're in the UK. But if you haven't, don't worry. I'm going to read it for you. And then at the end, I'm going to tell you the background of the person who wrote it. So for the Telegraph, Gen Z are an employer's nightmare. My 20s put them to shame. This woman is a journalist in her 30s. Have you ever heard the phrase anti-hustle? I hadn't until this week. The sheltered being that I am, but apparently it's quite common now and increasingly used to refer to job adverts. Job adverts that promote a work-life balance. They're anti-hustle, you see, because they don't advocate a ferocious, exhausting kind of labour. Instead, they offer a role which allows you to skip merrily from the office at 5 p.m, no hustle required. I love the framing of that. According to a new survey, the number of anti-hustle job adverts has shot up over 30% since the pandemic, with many more of them now emphasising their work-life balance to entice younger workers who won't tolerate the sort of hours that Scrooge went for. It chimes with what I keep hearing from my peers, that Gen Z, but 20-somethings coming up the ranks behind us are increasingly aware of their rights and exercising them. That's pretty good, I think. They don't want to work long days and know that their employers can't make them. They want a life outside the office. They are, in other words, anti-hustle. It's similar to the viral phrase lazy girl jobs, which a 26-year-old coined on TikTok last year to describe decently paid jobs which required minimum input and maximum flexibility. To which I would say, well, didn't we all want a life outside the office when we're in our 20s? But I want, never get. So already you see, the framing of this article is the typical millennial/boomer journalist fare of aren't Gen Z terrible for knowing their working rights and not wanting to destroy themselves, working jobs at companies that don't care about them and only exist to profit off their labor, and describing it as like anti-hustle, like it's a bad thing. Normalizing overtime and working for free is something glamorous. It's something that the capitalist class have been doing for ages, but I guess it comes out of like the neoliberalism of the 1980s. But Sophia's going to tell us about her 20s. So my first proper job, a job that I actually wanted to do after stints on shop floors and a spell in a Kennington estate agency, was an assistant on the Evening Standard's features desk. To an almost pathetic extent, I did everything that was asked of me. I made 42 billion cups of tea. I bought my boss's tights. I trialed Beyonce's maple syrup diet and Madonna's cardio regime. I stayed late, came in early, extremely early some days, once around 4 a.m, having spent the night loitering in a West End club, trying to wrinkle out a quote from the son of a recently disgraced MP. He didn't give me one. A few years later, working for a different newspaper, I arrived at 7 a.m. and left at 10 p.m. most days. If I ate from the canteen and didn't leave the building at lunch, I didn't see much daylight during the winter. But it's what I felt it was required to do to make a success of the chance I'd been given. What do rickets matter when you have a deadline? Plenty of wannabe journalists would have swapped places in an instant. I didn't want to be replaceable. Throughout my 20s, I sweated harder than I'd ever worked at school or university, and I remember thinking sick days were for wimps. Contrast that with the situation now. A friend who works in publishing recently told me it's getting increasingly hard to find employees who help at book launches in the evening because the junior staff in her office down tools at 5 p.m. It's in their contract. Okay, that seems fair then. My friend said with a helpless shrug, so she can't complain or even gently suggest otherwise. How are you going to advance if you aren't willing to work a bit of overtime? Do you want a job or a career? Don't get me started on Gen Z, says a friend who should remain anonymous for her own protection. They genuinely cannot understand they have to work longer than 8 hours a day. Also, she goes on in a furious tone, they're completely baffled by the fact they have to start at the bottom. They can't understand why they can't start on a mid-level senior salary. It's insane. So concluding, I don't believe I'd change anything, not even Beyonce's maple syrup diet, because I've had a largely terrific time and learned a few things while putting in the hours. Just this week, for example, I've had a builder work in the bathroom yet again because I have the leakiest house in Southeast London, and he complimented me on my excellent tea. If those coming after us are changing workplace attitudes, do some of us feel aggrieved because of the effort we put in, or is it jealousy that they're somehow so assertive? I can't imagine having the self-assurance at work 15 years ago to pack up my desk at 4:59 p.m. and stroll out guilt-free, and yet I would still humbly suggest that if you have any ambition, you need to do the time. So yeah, it's an article you've read a million times before. The generation ahead of us are kind of mad that they were so brainwashed that they did all this unpaid labour and are now mad that the younger generation know their rights better, and at the end saying, you know, if you want to get ahead in life, you're going to have to work like I did. Might I suggest you do that? Might I suggest if you're 22 out of university, you grind yourself into the dirt to progress your career, because only then will you be as successful as me. Someone who got, you know, my start at the Evening Standard, and someone who didn't take that amazing opportunity for granted and made sure I worked really, really hard every single day to make sure I'd have a successful career in journalism where I could write articles like this. So I got a few questions for people listening to me now. Do you believe this is actually how she succeeded in journalism? Do you believe that's really an honest account of her 20s as well? Like, maybe I can believe some of it. The thing about the nightclub, that just seems like coming in after a bender, but thankfully, People don't forget. The internet doesn't forget. So the Jazz Dad tweeting, Sophia, daughter of Crispin James Allen Neville Money Counts, 9th Baron Latimer of the Coutts family who founded the private bank and granddaughter of former editor of the Telegraph, hustled all the hours to build her career at checks note their Telegraph. So if you go into her own father, he's a British peer who's descended from Thomas Coutts, and in 2003 he inherited the title of Baron because we do live in Doon. He was educated at Eton and Oxford. Surprise, surprise. And Sophia's mother, Lucy Rose Deeds, as it said, Bill Deeds was a British Conservative politician, army officer and journalist. He was the first person in Britain to have been both a member of the cabinet and the editor of a major daily newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. To make that crystal clear for everyone, the article you just heard me read was written by someone whose granddad was a Conservative MP and also the old editor of that newspaper, and her father is a baron and they come from a banking family. And they all went to the same schools, Oxford, Cambridge and Eton. That's British journalism in a nutshell. That article written by that person who comes from that family, that is British journalism. That is everything that's wrong with British journalism in one little story. Lecturing younger people for knowing their working rights better than the older generation while pretending that all the opportunities in life they got were from their hard work, not that they come from two super wealthy families and work at the newspaper their granddad was the editor of. And he was also a Conservative MP and in the cabinet as well. And as bad as American corporate news is, and it is bad, you just don't have that like real old establishment money that keeps churning out the same people. Like most of our prime ministers went to Eton as well. Most people in privilege in this country go to Eton, then they go to university at Oxford and Cambridge, and they're all serving in the government right now. They own all the newspapers, they run all the banks. It is this really, really closed off club, and they love the classes and they keep pushing because it insulates them from the rest of us actually joining those ranks. Not that I'd want to personally, but it's not really a meritocracy in this country. And she probably seriously believes her career is because of her hard work. When she writes that article, there is no shame. She acts like she's the lowly university grad that we all were at some point, and the reason she succeeded and the reason we're not as Gen Z is because she worked hard. Obviously, her granddad, editor of the Telegraph, and also in the Conservative Party and the government, he comes from a long line of politicians and journalists basically being the same thing. So Boris Johnson was a journalist, and then after he resigned last year, he landed a Daily Mail column. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is currently a Conservative MP, but also a former member of the government, actually has a TV show on GB News. Rishi Sunak hired The Spectator's political editor as his political secretary, but don't worry, they did know each other before. James Forsyth was actually Rishi Sunak's best man, and his wife worked for Boris Johnson as a press secretary, and obviously hilariously resigned for being one of the main people to lie about the Partygate scandal. Obviously, back in the day, you had this. Theresa May hires BBC's Robbie Gibb as communications chief, and this is in 2017. The head of the BBC's political team at Westminster has been appointed to take over as Downing Street's director of communications. And this is the guy who ran the Brexit coverage and the 2017 election coverage. He runs that coverage for the impartial BBC that's meant to work for the public, and then goes and works for the Prime Minister straight afterwards. And then afterwards, he gets appointed to the BBC board as well, after he's done this, because it's a revolving door. BBC, politics, BBC. And that is even more true because recently we had this scandal, you guys will know this, the BBC chairman who donated over £400,000 to the Conservative Party, and the panel approving him as the BBC chair included a Tory party donor. So obviously last year he had to resign because of all the pressure, but he became chairman of the BBC in February 2021, but he resigned after a report found he breached the rules governing public appointments twice. A former banker, the 67-year-old earns £160,000 a year in the role, which he previously pledged to give to charity, because that's how rich he is. As a child, he spent part of his childhood in the US, where his father held senior positions at chemical giant Monsanto and telecoms company Cable and Wireless. He read PPE at Christchurch, Oxford, again Oxford, where he was a neighbour to the journalist Adam Bolton. His 40-year career in finance began with a job at JP Morgan, and then he had a long and very distinguished career at investment bank Goldman Sachs. There he was a senior figure when the young Mark Carney, the future Bank of England governor, also worked for the bank. One of Mr. Sharp's closest relationships at Goldman was a young man called Rishi Sunak. Mr. Sharp, a major Tory party donor who was on the board of the conservative think tank the Centre for Policy Studies, described Mr. Sunak to a friend as the best young financial analyst he had ever seen. Mr. Sharp went on to work for his old mentee Mr. Sunak when he was Chancellor, helping the government with loans to businesses at the beginning of the pandemic. According to the BBC, Mr. Sunak was mildly miffed at losing such a close ally at a crucial time, but was persuaded on the merits of Mr. Sharp taking up his new role at the BBC. Mr. Sharp has also known Boris Johnson for 20 years. The former Prime Minister said in a statement issued to the Sunday Times, Mr. Sharp said he was considered to be a Brexiteer and donated around £400,000 to the Conservative Party over the past 20 years. But this is why the guy actually resigned. About findings in part relate to Boris Johnson securing an £800,000 loan from the financier Sam Blythe while Prime Minister. First brought to light by the Sunday Times, Sharp introduced Blythe to the UK's top civil servant, Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, to discuss a potential loan. Sharp informed Johnson that he wished to apply to be the chair of the BBC board before he made his application in November 2020, and that he told the then PM ahead of his interview for the post that he would make the introduction between Blythe and Case. So yeah, basically this guy got the post because he hooked Boris Johnson up with a nearly £1 million loan from his banking mates. He was already familiar with Rishi Sunak because he was basically his mentor at Goldman Sachs. He's deeply tied with the British banking establishment. What does this guy have any business doing as one of the heads of the BBC? But again, British journalism, British politics is an absolute mess all the time because it's run by the same people who run everything. Like, Rishi Sunak has no business being the Prime Minister because his only experience is in banking and hedge fund managing, but he's the Prime Minister. It's the same with everything in our society. It's just run by wealthy people who don't deserve it based on merit in any sense of the word. The reason they get their posts is because of the connections they make at school and the connections they all have with each other from being in this very incestuous bubble that is formed at Eton, Oxford and Cambridge and continues in London once they all move there for their banking and journalism jobs. But then when you have stuff like this, it's not surprising that in 2019, you guys will probably remember this, Boris Johnson looked pretty dishevelled when he was laying a wreath for Remembrance Day in 2019. So the BBC thought it would be good to actually run footage from 2016 where he looked a lot more neat and tidy. Like, I'm not joking, someone swapped out footage from 3 years prior where, like, all the political leaders were different, including Boris Johnson, who wasn't the Prime Minister, and they stuck that in the news instead. And they say that's an error. No one at the BBC knew that looked weird. Of course they did. It was done on purpose, because they then did it again. BBC edits out boos from a replay of Johnson's arrival at a Jubilee event. So yeah, it's just so institutionally corrupt. Again, the BBC is meant to be impartial. But it's run by everyone who's in bed with the Tory party and the major banks in England. Now, one more note on this. It's a bit of a pivot, and no hate especially directed towards this person, because they're so irrelevant, but that's kind of the point, right? I specifically went back on Twitter to find my tweet about this. It's from like a year ago. There was someone called Reem Ibrahim who started popping up on the BBC as like a talking head, and her credentials were being the comms for IEA London, the UK's original free market think tank. And someone tweeted, Harwood's Law, referring to another person like this person, if you are a Tory under the age of 30, you're never more than 3 days away from being on Politics Live, right? So the BBC is meant to be impartial. So here it has someone under the age of 30 who is like a spokesperson for basically an extreme libertarian think tank. There was literally such an insignificant amount of people under 30 in the UK who subscribe to this ideology. There would be no point in platforming it if you're trying to be impartial, right? But that's what the BBC does. It starts normalizing more extreme voices in terms of economics. And that's why this person, who only has 12,000 followers on Twitter, despite always posting on it, barely has any social media followers, they get invited on the BBC to talk about stuff, right? I haven't been invited on the BBC. I've got far more social media followers than this person, far more social media views. You would say I'm actually a more relevant person in terms of UK political discussion than this person. And honestly, I'm not relevant at all, right? So I wouldn't expect an invite from the BBC. But at the same time, if you're inviting people like this on just because they're a mouthpiece for an extreme libertarian think tank, then surely I deserve some airtime as well. My views are far more representative of more people and more young people in the country than this person. But again, the BBC always wheel out these people you've never heard of who like represent, I don't know, the Adam Smith Institute and stuff, to always frame the economic discussion in ways that aren't impartial. The Overton window in the BBC is so right-wing, you barely ever get actual socialists going on the TV talking about economics in a way that actually makes sense to people, actually reflects the reality, and doesn't reflect like libertarianism or just the way hedge fund managers and bankers view economics. And again, that's why the public are so economically illiterate, because we're meant to rely on the BBC for a lot of education, and this is what we get. Randos hauled in from any like free market think tank and given a massive platform to help sway the discussion in the right-wing direction, because yes, the BBC has at many times been run by actual bankers, and honestly, banker, politician, journalist in the UK, it's all the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm not joking. There's no credentials needed for any of this stuff. It's just that you went to Eton with Boris Johnson and you knew Rishi Sunak, so here's a job at, you know, the BBC. Boris Johnson, here's a column at the Daily Mail. Jacob Rees-Mogg, here's a TV show. Doesn't matter if you've ever worked in media, just go on, do that as well. So I hope I illustrated why the UK is uniquely terrible for journalism. And it's because it's an elitist club only pretty much for the upper class. And it's so easy for them to get jobs in journalism because, as we saw, your granddad might have been a Conservative MP who also was editor of the paper, while your father is a baron and your whole family major money in banking, right? So it's very easy for you to get a job in journalism. Or, you know, you might be Boris Johnson or Boris Johnson's sister. You might be Rishi Sunak's best man and also the political editor of The Spectator, who then goes to work for Rishi Sunak. You might be the head of the BBC's politics coverage at one of the most pivotal times in recent history, and then go work for Theresa May, and then go work for the BBC again afterwards. It's honestly really, really sickening. And I'll just say to people, treat the BBC with as much skepticism as you treat CNN or any American corporate news, and just appreciate it's right wing and it's not impartial in any way, and it's pretty much irredeemable. The BBC, in my opinion, has never been a force for good in this country. A lot of liberals will cry about the BBC. I definitely won't, and I won't cry about if it dies. I think it's a bad thing because it frames itself as impartial. People think it's impartial. People think it's objective. So when they get their news from it, they think they're consuming like news without any like huge political bias, when in reality, it does have a massive political bias. It's pro-right-wing, pro-Tory, and pro-capitalist, and it's not impartial in the slightest. So anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.